I still remember the first time he insisted I should travel without him. It sounded harmless on the surface, almost caring, the way he framed it. He said it would be good for me to disconnect a little, that I'd been too stressed and needed a break. At first, I thought he was just being thoughtful, a husband wanting his wife to rest. But something in the way he pushed the idea felt off, like he was a little too eager to see me out of the house. I brushed that feeling aside, like I'd done with so many small, uncomfortable things before. Travel used to be our thing. In the beginning, we were that couple who saved every extra penny for a weekend away, even if it was just a cheap inn 2 towns over. He used to hold my hand on the plane, squeeze it during takeoff, pretend he wasn't scared while I pretended I believed him. We had little rituals, sharing one dessert, arguing over which museum to skip, getting lost on purpose just to explore. So when he started saying it was better if I went alone, it felt like someone had quietly erased my name from our plans. I kept telling myself marriages change, people mature, things calm down. The way he talked about it, though, didn't match the man I thought I knew. He said I was always taking care of everything and everyone, that I deserved time just for myself. On papel, it was flattering. In real life, it sounded rehearsed. He had this overly calm tone, as if he'd practiced the lines in the mirror beforehand. Every time I hesitated, he'd double down, insisting it would make me come back lighter, that I'd thank him one day. I remember feeling a small knot form in my stomach, but I swallowed it and smiled, telling him he was probably right, because for years I'd been trained to doubt my instincts before I ever doubted him. Still, the way he hovered while I packed for that first trip alone made my skin prickle. He kept popping into the bedroom, pretending to look for things he didn't need, watching me choose clothes like he was checking a list in his head. Every time I caught his eye, he flashed that too wide smile, the kind that doesn't touch the eyes. He even joked that I should enjoy the silence without him snoring, but his laugh sounded flat, mechanical. I tried to tease him back, but the air between us felt tight, like we were both pretending this was normal. In the days leading up to the trip, he became strangely attentive, offering to make dinner, folding laundry he never touched, sending me good morning texts he'd long stopped sending. I should have been thrilled, right? Any woman would have thought her husband was reconnecting. But I felt more like I was being managed, like he was smoothing the path to something he didn't want me to trip over. I'd wake up with my heart thudding for no reason, telling myself it was just anxiety, or maybe age, or maybe work. Anything but him. Doubting him felt like doubting the entire foundation of my life. The night before I left, he held me a little too tightly when he hugged me. His hands lingered on my back, warm and almost trembling. He whispered that I deserved this trip, that he'd be fine on his own, that I shouldn't worry about a thing. But his voice cracked on the last sentence. I remember pulling back and looking at him, really looking, trying to read something in his expression. All I saw was a man desperate for me to walk out the door in the morning. I kissed him goodnight, feeling a heaviness settle in my chest, an unspoken fear I couldn't name yet. When morning came, I moved through the house like I was wading through water, everything slow and strangely muffled. He acted almost giddy as he helped load my suitcase into the trunk, wiping imaginary dust off the handle like he couldn't wait to close it. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that maybe he was just excited for me, proud even. But deep down, something was twisting inside me, an instinct I'd learned to silence over the years. He kissed my forehead instead of my lips, a tiny detail, but it hit me like a cold splash. It felt distant, polite, like I was a guest leaving his home instead of his wife. At the airport drop-off, he hugged me quickly, checking his watch twice, pretending it was about traffic. He insisted I text him as soon as I boarded, and again when I landed, and again when I got to the hotel. Too many check-ins for a man who suddenly wanted distance. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease clung to me like humidity. I remember turning around after walking a few steps, wanting one last look, maybe reassurance, maybe affection. Instead, I saw him already back in the car, head down, tapping his phone like he had somewhere else to be, someone else to talk to. As I sat waiting for my flight, surrounded by the hum of engines and rolling suitcases, I felt a strange pressure build behind my ribs, a whisper of dread. I tried to distract myself by looking at other travelers, couples sharing snacks, families juggling toddlers, people reading newspapers, life moving smoothly around me while my own felt suddenly crooked. A thought crossed my mind, sharp, unwelcome. What if he wanted me gone? I pushed it away instantly, but the seed was planted, quietly, stubbornly. And even though I didn't know it yet, that single uneasy moment would become the thread that unraveled everything. The first night of the trip felt heavier than it should have. I checked into the hotel, dropped my suitcase on the floor, and stood in the middle of the room like a stranger in someone else's life. The walls hummed with the muted sounds of other guests, laughter, a shower running, heels clicking down the hallway. Yet everything inside me felt painfully quiet. I tried to convince myself I just needed rest, that maybe he was right and I really did deserve some time alone. But every time I looked at the empty side of the bed, it hit me like a small heartbreak I didn't have a reason for. Not yet. I went out for dinner, hoping a meal would ground me. The restaurant was cozy, warm lights reflecting off wine glasses, the smell of garlic and butter drifting through the air. Couples filled most of the tables, women leaning into their partners, men laughing with their arms draped across chair backs. I watched them the way someone watches a window during a storm, quietly, longingly, pretending they aren't freezing on the inside. I used to be one of those women, you know? I used to reach across the table and touch his wrist without thinking. But that night, every happy couple felt like a reminder of something slipping from my fingers. When I called him after dinner, the phone rang too long. When he finally answered, he sounded distracted, like I'd caught him mid-thought or mid-something. He said he was just watching TV, but there was a delay before he spoke, as if he had to switch scenes in his mind. I asked how his day was, and he said fine, so quickly it felt like a dismissal. No details, no warmth, just a flat reassurance that should have calmed me but only deepened the ache. I hung up telling myself I was being needy, dramatic even. I had no idea that later, I'd look back at that call as the first crack in the mask he'd been wearing. The next morning, I tried to force myself into vacation mode, ordered room service, opened the curtains wide, even took a long shower hoping the steam would clear the heaviness from my chest. But nothing worked. Everything felt staged, like I was acting out a version of relaxation I couldn't actually feel. I kept checking my phone, half expecting him to send a sweet message, a photo of something silly he did, maybe even a simple miss you. Instead, hours passed with nothing. The silence between us didn't feel peaceful. It felt intentional, like a door slowly closing while I waited on the wrong side. I decided to walk around the town to distract myself, wandering into little shops selling handmade candles and postcards with watercolor landscapes. Normally, I love that kind of thing. I'm the woman who stops to smell every candle, who buys magnets she doesn't need. But that day, I moved through the streets mechanically, noticing details without really feeling them. There was a couple ahead of me taking turns photographing each other, laughing at their awkward poses. A part of me wanted to smile at them, but another part, the louder part, felt a tight sting of jealousy. I used to have that. I used to feel chosen, wanted, included. Later that afternoon, I called him again, trying to sound cheerful. This time he answered quickly, too quickly, like he had the phone in his hand waiting for it. But his tone didn't match. He said he was just resting, using that same clipped voice from the night before. I asked him what he ate for lunch. An innocent question, right? And he hesitated. I actually heard the pause. Then he said he didn't remember, which hurt more than it should have. Since when does a man forget something he ate 2 hours earlier? When we hung up, I stared at the phone like it had betrayed me too. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the way one feels a storm before it breaks. That evening, I went down to the hotel bar, thinking maybe a glass of wine would mellow out my nerves. The place was dimly lit, full of soft jazz and the clinking of ice in glasses. I watched people chatting, flirting, unwinding. Everyone seemed effortlessly present, while I felt like a ghost drifting through my own trip. I kept replaying his strange pauses, the way his voice sounded like he was looking over his shoulder. I told myself I was being paranoid, but my stomach wouldn't unclench. It's funny how your body knows the truth long before your mind is willing to see it. I sat by the window with my wine, watching cars slide past in the rain. That's when I made the decision to cut the trip short. It came quietly, like a soft click inside me. I wasn't even thinking about catching him. I just wanted to go home, to sleep in my own bed, to stop feeling like I was floating outside my own life. I texted him that I was tired and heading to bed early, and he replied with a simple, "Good, rest." No heart, no sweet nickname he used to use, no miss you. Just cold approval, like my silence was convenient for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, blankets twisted around my legs, the AC humming louder than normal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of him, smirking, nervous, tapping his phone, checking his watch as he dropped me off. Images that didn't make sense yet, but felt like puzzle pieces waiting to click into place. By 3 a.m., I'd made up my mind. I changed my flight, packed quietly, and stood in that empty hotel room with my heart pounding. I didn't know what I'd find at home. I just knew I needed to go. Something, instinct, fate, whatever, was pulling me back faster than I could understand. When the plane touched down the next afternoon, my pulse was already thudding in my ears. I'd barely slept, barely eaten, running on instinct more than logic. As I rolled my suitcase through the airport, I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I'd walk into the house and find him dozing on the couch, TV humming, the same predictable peace as always. But the closer I got to home, the heavier the air felt around me, like the world itself was holding its breath. My hands were actually trembling on the steering wheel, something that had never happened to me before. Pulling into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was that his car was there. That shouldn't have meant anything. He worked from home often, but the sight of it gave me a strange jolt, like catching a shadow move in the corner of your eye. The curtains in the living room were half drawn, not fully open like he always left them during the day. Another tiny detail that shouldn't have mattered, but did. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second, listening to the tick-tick-tick of the cooling metal, my breath uneven. I told myself to calm down, that people change routines all the time. Still, something inside me whispered, "Be careful." When I opened the front door, the house greeted me with a smell that didn't belong to me. A sweet floral perfume, too young, too strong, too deliberate. Not the kind of scent that lingers by accident. My heart plummeted so fast I felt dizzy. The air was warm, thick, as if multiple bodies had been in the room not long ago. My own home suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. I closed the door softly behind me, barely breathing, every sense sharpened. From upstairs I heard it, just a faint shuffle, a whisper of movement. My stomach dropped to the floor. I stood there for a moment, frozen, gripping the handle of my suitcase like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud, frantic, almost painful. The house wasn't silent the way an empty house is silent. It was the kind of silence that tries too hard, the kind that hides something. Every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't alone. I set my suitcase down slowly, quietly, the wheels barely making a sound on the hardwood. For a second, I actually thought about turning around and walking back out, pretending I never came home early. Pretending ignorance could protect me from the truth. But something stronger pulled me forward. Maybe pride, maybe anger. Maybe that buried part of me that had been collecting tiny red flags for months without consciously realizing it. I started walking toward the stairs, each step feeling like I was crossing into a life I hadn't agreed to. Halfway up, I heard it again. A muffled thump, a whispered shh, the sound of someone desperately trying not to be heard. My throat tightened so hard I could barely swallow. I wasn't imagining anything. Someone was in my house. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Someone. With him. The hallway at the top of the stairs felt longer than it ever had. My feet moved slowly, but my mind raced. Images, suspicions, memories I had brushed aside all snapping together like magnets. I reached our bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled into the hallway, warm and eerie. My fingers shook as I pushed it open, not fully, just enough to see inside. And there he was, my husband, half-dressed, shirt unbuttoned, belt undone, eyes wide like a child caught stealing. And behind him, scrambling to hide behind the closet door, was a woman I had never seen before. Blonde, young, wearing almost nothing. The sight hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, everything inside me went eerily still, like my mind shut down to protect itself. I didn't scream, or cry, or rush forward the way people imagine they would. I just stood there, gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles went white. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first, just a choking sort of gasp, like he'd run out of lies before he could even pick one. Then he finally stuttered, You weren't supposed to be home yet," as if that was the real tragedy here, not the betrayal, not the humiliation, just the timing. The woman behind him whimpered out some pathetic apology, something like, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know," while she clutched her clothes to her chest. But even her voice sounded unsure, like she wasn't fully convinced she was innocent. My husband kept babbling, words spilling out of him in chaotic bursts. "This isn't what it looks like. I can explain," and the one that made my stomach curl. "You overreact to things." He said it all while half-dressed, while another woman trembled behind him. I felt a sharp, cold clarity wash over me, the kind that comes right before a storm. My body finally reacted, my hands started shaking, my throat burned, my legs felt weak. But inside, something hardened. A deep, rooted part of me snapped into place. I realized in that moment that I wasn't going to fall apart for him, not this time. I took a slow breath, lifted my chin, and stepped back from the door as if I'd suddenly outgrown the space. I didn't shout. I didn't demand explanations. I simply looked at him, really looked, and saw a stranger wearing my husband's face. Then I said nothing at all. Silence became my shield. And as he scrambled toward me, babbling pleas, I turned and walked down the hallway, leaving the two of them tangled in their own mess. I made it halfway down the stairs before he caught up to me, grabbing the banister like he needed it to stay upright. He kept calling my name in this frantic, breathless voice, the kind people use when they're afraid of losing something they never bothered to take care of. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I knew I'd see panic all over his face, and some twisted part of me was terrified I'd mistake it for remorse. He kept saying things like, "I walked in at the wrong moment," as if there was ever a right moment to find your husband with another woman in your bedroom. His words sounded cheap, flung at me like scraps. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, he finally stepped in front of me, half-dressed and sweating, begging me to just talk. He said I was blowing things out of proportion, that what I saw wasn't actually what it looked like, that he never meant to hurt me. Every cliché in the book tumbled out of him. And while he spoke, all I could think about were the months leading up to that moment, the sudden push for me to travel alone, the distance he cloaked in fake tenderness, the rehearsed lines about needing space. I saw every red flag clearly now, lined up like lights on a runway guiding me straight to this disaster. He had been planning my absence, crafting it, banking on it. The other woman appeared at the top of the stairs then, dressed this time, clutching her shoes in her hands. She looked pale, as if she too was realizing the gravity of what she'd stepped into. She whispered that she'd go, like this was just an awkward party she needed to leave early from. I watched my husband whip his head around to tell her to wait, because apparently the last thing he wanted was for his little secret to walk out before he could control the narrative. That was the moment something in me broke cleanly, sharply, like a bone snapping under pressure. I felt the anger rise, not the messy, chaotic kind, but the quiet, decisive kind that changes everything. I stepped around him, refusing to let his body block my path, and walked into the living room. My legs felt steady in a way they hadn't moments before, as if my anger had reached down and snapped me back into myself. He followed close behind, still rambling excuses, tossing out fragmented sentences about being lonely and feeling disconnected. He said it like he was the one who'd been abandoned, as if my trips, the ones he pushed me into, were proof I didn't care about him. Hearing him twist the story that way made something inside me ignite, slow and controlled, like a fuse finally catching fire. I turned to face him, and for the first time since I'd gotten home, I spoke. My voice didn't shake the way I expected. It came out low and steady, the kind of voice that forces a person to really listen. I told him I knew exactly what he'd been doing for months. I laid out every detail I had noticed but ignored. His sudden encouragement for solo trips, the way he barely contacted me whenever I was away, the oddly timed attention right before I'd leave. I watched his face crumple as I spoke, like each word chipped away at the story he'd been building for himself. He tried to interrupt, but I lifted a hand, and he actually stopped. For once, he listened, instead of lied. He muttered something about how he never wanted things to get this far, like cheating on your wife only becomes real once you're caught. He kept pacing, running his hands through his hair, moaning about how stress made him do stupid things. Then he said it, the line that would stay burned into my memory forever. If you just stayed on your trip like I asked, none of this would have happened. I swear the room went silent after that. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop. He said it as if my early return was the betrayal, as if his infidelity was something I forced him into. And in that moment, something in me hardened beyond repair. Hearing those words, those vile, twisted words, did something to me I can't fully explain. It was like a veil finally lifted, and I saw him not as my husband, not as the man I'd built a life with, but as a coward hiding behind excuses he hoped would stick. My anger didn't explode. It crystallized. It became sharp, precise, almost elegant. I felt my shoulders straighten, my breath even out. I wasn't going to cry for him. I wasn't going to scream or beg for answers. I simply let the truth settle in my chest like a stone. This man didn't deserve the devastation he'd caused in me. I walked past him again, heading to the bedroom. Not our bedroom anymore, just a place I needed to enter to get what belonged to me. He followed, still pleading, still trying to spin the narrative into something he could control. But his words sounded small now, irrelevant, like background noise in a scene I no longer played a role in. I grabbed a bag and filled it with essentials, clothes, documents, the few sentimental things he hadn't already poisoned with his lies. My hands shook, but not from fear, from finality, from the weight of a decision forming in real time. When I zipped the bag and finally turned to him, he looked terrified, not of losing me, but of losing the version of me who tolerated his half-truths, his emotional crumbs, his manipulations. He reached for my arm, asking me to pause and think about what we're doing. And I swear, hearing him say we almost made me laugh. I pulled my arm away gently, calmly, and told him he had already done all the thinking for both of us when he brought another woman into our home, into our bed. I told him I wouldn't be staying, not tonight, not ever in the way he wanted. Then I walked out, his voice chasing me down the stairs, begging me not to throw our marriage away, as if he hadn't set it on fire long before I returned home early. I spent that first night away at a friend's house, lying on her couch with a blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling like it was the only thing holding me together. The silence around me felt different from the silence in my home. It wasn't tense or suffocating. It was honest. My friend made me tea, held my hand, didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. And the strangest thing happened. Somewhere between the steam of the cup and the steady rhythm of my breathing, I felt something inside me click into place. Not healing, not yet, but clarity. A quiet certainty that I wasn't going back to the life he'd been leading behind my back. The next morning, I gathered every piece of evidence I had without even meaning to. Airline confirmations he'd practically shoved at me. Text messages where he pushed me to take time for myself. Screenshots of our call logs from the trips where he barely contacted me. The more I collected, the more obvious the pattern became. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't made a mistake. He'd built a system. My absence was his window. My trips were his alibi. Realizing that made my stomach twist, but it also fueled something fierce in me. Betrayal is one thing, strategy is another, and he had been strategic. I made an appointment with a lawyer, not because I was eager to destroy him overnight, but because I needed someone unemotional to help me see the truth with legal clarity. The lawyer listened, expression unreadable, then nodded slowly and said, You're dealing with someone who took advantage of your trust systematically. Hearing those words from a stranger hit harder than his infidelity. It wasn't a lapse, it was a routine, a lifestyle, a choice. And for the first time since walking into that bedroom, I felt a spark of something powerful. Not revenge, not yet, but justice. A desire to take back control in a way he never saw coming. As the lawyer laid out my options, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Like the emotional storm of the past days had carved out a new version of myself. A quieter one, but sharper. He explained how the evidence of infidelity would shift things in my favor, how the pattern of him encouraging my absence could be framed as deliberate manipulation. I listened carefully, nodding, taking notes with a steady hand. Every word he said felt like another brick being removed from the tower my husband thought he had built around me. He had counted on my softness, my trust, my silence. He hadn't counted on me waking up. After leaving the lawyer's office, I sat in my car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel just as I had the day I returned home early. But this time, my hands didn't shake. I felt grounded, anchored. I pulled up our joint banking app and stared at the numbers. Money he assumed I would never touch. Money we had both earned, yet he acted like it was his kingdom to rule. With a deep breath, I transferred my half into a separate account. The confirmation ping sounded like a small victory, a quiet reclaiming of something he'd taken for granted. I knew this wasn't revenge. This was survival. Later that afternoon, he called. 5 times, 6, 8. I didn't answer. When he finally texted, his tone swung wildly, from desperate to angry to pitiful. He said things like I was ruining everything, that we could fix this if I stopped acting cold, that I was punishing him for a mistake he already apologized for. But here's the thing. He never apologized. Not really. He apologized for me coming home early, for misreading his actions, for triggering something he claimed he couldn't control. He apologized for inconvenience, not betrayal. I stared at his messages, feeling nothing but a clean, clear distance, a distance I intended to keep. 2 days later, I went back to the house, not to reconcile, not to argue, but to finish what I had started. I stepped inside with the same calm I'd practiced in the mirror, a calm that came from knowing exactly who I was dealing with now. He rushed toward me the second I walked in, eyes wide, voice trembling like he thought a shaky performance might win me back. He reached for my arm, asking if we could talk like adults, as if adulthood had anything to do with what he'd done. I pulled my arm back gently, firmly, and told him I wasn't there to talk. I was there to end things. When I handed him the envelope with the paperwork, he went pale. You'd think he saw a ghost. He opened it with frantic hands, muttering my name like a plea and a curse all at once. When he realized what it was, divorce papers, freezing orders, evidence laid out neatly, his mouth fell open. Then came the excuses, the bargaining, the anger. He said I was being vindictive, that I was throwing away years of marriage, that he only strayed because he felt neglected. He said everything except the truth, that he'd betrayed me, used me, lied to me every time he pushed me to leave town so he could play single in our home. That part he skipped. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't break down. I simply told him the truth, that he had spent months preparing the stage for his affair, and I was now preparing the stage for my freedom. His expression twisted into something between outrage and disbelief, like he couldn't fathom the idea of me walking away cleanly, without begging, without collapse. He asked what I expected him to do, and I remember looking him straight in the eyes and saying, I expect you to face the consequences you created. All of them. Then I picked up the keys I had placed on the table, my new house keys, not his, and walked out. This time he didn't follow. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet, as if life had lowered its volume so I could hear myself think again. For the first time in years, I woke up without bracing for something, his mood, his silence, his disappointment. I remember standing in my new kitchen one morning, sunlight spilling across the counter, holding a mug of coffee with both hands, and I just breathed. It wasn't a triumphant moment, nothing cinematic. It was simple, soft. But it felt like reclaiming a part of me I didn't even realize I'd surrendered piece by piece while trying to keep our marriage afloat. Healing didn't come in a straight line. Some days I felt strong, almost buoyant, like shedding him had lightened something heavy in my bones. Other days, the memories hit out of nowhere. The perfume in my hallway, the look on his face when he said I wasn't supposed to be home yet, the hours I spent doubting myself instead of him. But every time the pain resurfaced, it felt a little less sharp, like a bruise fading. I learned to let the ache sit beside me instead of swallowing me whole. I didn't try to rush myself into forgiveness or forgetfulness. I just let the truth settle, and slowly, it stopped hurting as much. I began forming new rituals, lighting a candle in the evening, taking walks after dinner, buying myself flowers every Sunday, something I never did when I was married because I kept waiting for him to remember I liked them. My house became a quiet companion rather than a battlefield, and in that stillness, I discovered something unexpected. I liked my own company. I liked who I was without him. The woman who returned home early from that trip wasn't the same woman who now woke up each day choosing peace over loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it. As the paperwork moved forward and the dust settled, people around me reacted in all kinds of ways. Some were shocked, some whispered, some tried to offer advice wrapped in pity. But a few, just a precious few, looked at me with quiet pride, as if they knew exactly how much strength it took to walk away from a life that was supposed to feel safe. My lawyer called one afternoon to update me, and when she said everything was moving in my favor, I felt a warmth spread through me. Not because I wanted to win, but because I had finally stopped losing myself. I started therapy, something I had always postponed because life with him left little room for my emotional needs. My therapist helped me understand things I had buried under years of compromise. She told me that betrayal isn't just the act, it's the erosion that happens long before the act ever takes place. She helped me see how I'd been shrinking to fit his comfort, mistaking his withdrawal for my shortcomings. And for the first time, I allowed myself to grieve, not just the marriage, but the version of me who stayed hopeful even when the signs were painfully clear. Little by little, I reintroduced myself to joy. I tried cooking recipes I used to avoid because he was picky. I rearranged furniture without asking anyone's opinion. I signed up for a painting class even though I've never been artistic. I laughed, really laughed, at things that had nothing to do with pretending I was fine. And somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just healing from him. I was rediscovering who I was before the lies, before the gaslighting, before the quiet loneliness he disguised as love. And that realization felt more liberating than any revenge I could have planned. One morning, months after the chaos had settled, I found myself browsing airline tickets again. This time, there was no knot in my stomach, no second guessing, no invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I wasn't running away from anything, and no one was pushing me out the door. I chose a destination I'd always wanted to see, somewhere warm, somewhere vibrant, somewhere that felt like the opposite of the life I'd been living. When I clicked confirm, I felt a quiet thrill ripple through me. Not because of the trip itself, but because I no longer feared coming home early. On the day of the flight, I stood in the mirror and barely recognized myself, not in a dramatic makeover sense, but in the softness around my eyes, the steadiness in my breath. I looked like a woman who had survived something heavy and didn't let it harden her. At the airport, I watched couples holding hands and felt no bitterness. I simply smiled and walked toward my gate with my shoulders relaxed and my heart open. For the first time in so long, I wasn't comparing my life to anyone else's. I was just living mine. As the plane lifted off, I let my head rest against the window, watching the world shrink beneath me. I thought about the night I came home early, about the version of myself who stood trembling in that bedroom doorway. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore. I felt gratitude. She saved me. She listened to her intuition even when it terrified her. She forced the truth into the light. And I promised myself then, somewhere above the clouds, that I would never silence her again. Betrayal didn't break me. It redirected me. And this trip? It was the first one I was finally taking for myself.